Hello, and welcome to Collie Conversations, the podcast that's all about transforming your life with your Border Collie. I'm Gemma Fisher, your expert in all things collie. Whether you're dealing with reactivity, recall struggles, or just looking to understand your collie better, you've come to the right place. I'm here to help you turn those frustrating behaviours into wins with practical advice and real-life solutions. If you haven't already, head over to our Facebook group to get your collie questions answered in my weekly live Q&A session. Plus, the group also has training guides, my recommended resources from the podcast, and lots of other extra support and tips for collie owners just like you. Today, we're going to be discussing the complexities of loose lead walking training in more depth and how to turn it from a struggle into a strength. So grab a cup of tea and get ready to make some notes. Let's get started. So to start thinking about loose lead walking, we want to think step by step what that process looks like, because it's normally that there's a piece of the puzzle that is a little bit off. So we want to figure out which piece of the puzzle is a little bit off. So I'm going to start by saying, have we got the right kit? All right. So are we using a collar versus using, say, a harness or a head collar or something like that? What length of lead are we using? Is it a normal lead or is it an extendable lead, long line? So a couple of thoughts on these things. I personally think that if we know that our Border Collie is going to be pulling a lot, a harness is going to be better for them physically, because I don't really want to garrot them by having them on a collar and knowing that they're just going to be putting all of that pressure on their windpipe. So in the first instance, it might be that I need to get them used to the idea of wearing a harness. And there are some Border Collies that really don't like that very much. And we're going to talk in a little bit more depth about that a bit later. From a safety perspective, it might be necessary that we use something like a head collar. If we have a very strong, big dog that is lunging, towards traffic or anything like that, we might need to think about using a head collar. Though my preference would be that we are trying to avoid putting them in situations where, really there is no other choice than to use something like that. In terms of length of lead, some people will use quite a short lead because they'll go into their local pet shop and their local pet shop will have maybe a lead that's a metre long. And if you're anything like my mum will then wrap the lead around her hand because she wants to feel like she's definitely got a lead around her hand. And the issue with that is that now that 1 metre lead is now maybe half a metre or less. So in terms of the dog being able to demonstrate any loose lead walking, it's completely out the question because there isn't enough lead to be able to do that on. So for me, I quite like a 2 metre, a 2.5 metre lead. And certainly if you're going to be using a harness with 2 points of contact, where there's a clip both on the front bit of the harness and also on the back, you are going to need a longer lead, because you're going to be able then to be able to use both points. But obviously, if you've only got a 1 metre lead, that's not going to work very well. Now, extendable leads are obviously quite popular and they can be a really useful way to give your dog a little bit of extra lead. But one of the things to bear in mind about extendable leads is that essentially they work by the dog pulling. So to get more distance away from you, to be able to get more freedom away from you, they require the dog to pull. All right, there has to be tension in that lead at all times. And one of the things that we ideally want to avoid is teaching our dogs that tension in the lead is a good thing. So if you're working on your loose lead walking, what I would suggest you do is you try and differentiate for the dog the difference between when they're on the extendable lead and they're allowed a bit more freedom versus when you're doing your loose lead walking practice. So that might look like you can have a bit more lead if you are clipped to the back of your harness, but we're going to do collar to lead if we're working on our loose lead walking and I'm going to be using a regular lead. Quite often people will use a long line with their dogs because that helps with their recall practice, which is, all good. That's good management. However, one thing I would say is that I like to give my dogs the difference between what their lead looks like and what their long line looks like. So their long line gives them a lot more freedom, but their long line is the backup tool for their recall. So if I call my dog and they don't respond to me, then what I'm going to look to do with a long line is reel them in like a big fish and, remove some of their freedom because, they've ignored their recall cue. Now, if I'm only using the long line, it's difficult for the dog really to know what the difference might look like. So for me, if a dog has ignored their recall cue, then I'm going to pop them back on the lead for a little bit of time out because essentially, as I say, I need them to understand that listening to their recall cue is really important to me. So I like to use both a lead and a long line, even if I know that when I get down to the park, it's the long line I'm going to be using. So possibly it's having something like a rucksack on your back so that you can have the two things available. So just a small bit on the kit and making sure that we've got the right kit. But the next piece would be, does the dog have value for being by your side, on your left and on your right hand side? Now, one of the things that you will probably find is that no, they don't, not really, because as a puppy, or even if they've come into your life as a rescue dog, the work that you've done is probably out in front of you. So when we teach our dogs to sit, to lie down, to do, tricks and things, where are they getting their treats? When they're sat in front of us. That's kind of how it works. So for them, there probably isn't a lot of value for being alongside us on the left or alongside us on the right. So that's something that we're going to need to think about, and we'll talk in a bit more depth about that a bit later. I talked about this a little bit last week. So we also have the issue that the dog has to have the ability to regulate their pace alongside the slower human pace. They've got 4 legs, we've got 2. It doesn't take a lot of mass to know that they will potentially be walking faster than we will. So it might require some work on body awareness. It might require a little bit of work on the criteria of what being able to walk alongside me looks like. And I will play lots of fun games with my dogs just to make sure that they can demonstrate that, yes, they truly understand that they have to pay attention to what all of their 4 legs are doing when they're doing their loose lead walking. We have some verbal cues that we're going to need. For me personally, I use the word close for my left-hand side and the word side for my right-hand side. I also give them permissions. So I will say, go sniff or go say hi, depending on what is in the environment and they want to do. Those things give them permission to stop doing their loose lead walking. All right. So if it's okay, go sniff, then they're allowed to go and sniff the lamppost or the hedgerow or wherever we happen to be walking. But if they've been asked to, can you come by my close, at my side, then those things mean that you need to stay in position by my close or my side. And so those permissions are important because they give the dog a break in between performing that behavior. I mentioned a little bit before, so the different permissions the kit can give the dog an idea for. So walking nicely on the collar, but maybe you give them a bit more freedom if you're clipping the lead to their harness. That makes really good sense to dogs I've worked with in the past, that they can go, oh, okay, so I'm clipped onto my collar, therefore we are rehearsing our loose lead walking. But as I say, on the harness, I might be able to, I might want to give you a bit more freedom. An important piece of the puzzle is making sure that we have calm behavior when the walking kit is being put on. So what I don't really want to be doing is wrestling with a Border Collie when they're excited about going out for a walk. What I'd like them to demonstrate is that they can breathe in and out, they can remain calm whilst their loose lead walking kit is going on. Because if they can't do that, it's unlikely that when we, go over the threshold of the doorway out into the outside world, that they're suddenly going to be able to do it. All right. So it's important that they are calm before we start. It's really important that we get loose lead walking practice in different environments. Okay. So I've talked about this before, the difference between like a reception level environment versus a university level environment. Now, mostly when people practice, they practice in their living rooms at home. They maybe practice at their local dog training class in the hall with, very little going on, but they don't practice very many other places, or the practice is happening in real life. So it's, we're trying to go from point A to point B to be able to go for our dog walk for the day. So it's really important for us to create a list. And I'm going to talk through that in some more detail. And that's going to be your homework actually for today's podcast. We talked a little bit about this last week. 3 Ds, so distance, distraction, and duration. So distance, fairly obvious. It's the distance between your dog and a distraction. The distraction is how difficult the distraction is for your dog. And obviously that will vary from dog to dog. And then duration, so the length of time you want the dog to be able to perform the loose lead walking. So those are 3 things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to why this particular behavior might be tricky for our dogs. So as I say, we talked about the right kit. Now, if I am putting a harness on a dog, and I've had some of my dogs, when they came home as puppies, they were happy to have their harnesses put on. And then Todd, when he came home, he was like, he wasn't aggressive or anything like that, but he just looked miserable. He just looked really sad when the harness went on. And one of the things that I think is really important is making sure that we have a good fit for that harness. Ladies will understand when I talk about, sometimes with like a bra fitting, you have to go and try these things on because getting the right measurements can be tricky, and getting that comfort level is important. So going into a more an independent pet shop, there's a really good one close to us that does harness fittings. So going in and doing a harness fitting will really make sure that you're getting the right one, that it isn't just a question of the size that your dog is, but you've put it on them, and the difference between, say, a short coated Border Collie versus a long coated Border Collie. You might want more padding for a short coated Border Collie, for example. Anyway, here's my step-by-step for a happier harness fitting. So first and foremost, human practice, okay? Get a soft toy dog, which you can use to practice putting the harness on and off quickly and cleanly. The number of times I have watched a very patient dog having their person put their harness onto them. Yeah, bless them. Not all dogs are particularly gracious about this. Some will go and hide under the sofa, more like the dining room table more than the sofa, but they will get out of the way. They will, they are not interested in helping. And worse than that, they might look to nip their person as the harness is going on. So make sure that you are well practiced and you can do it quickly and cleanly. The other bit of homework that I will give my students to do is to practice taking the lead clip on and off with only one hand and without looking. And this means that you're less likely to be over the top of your dog when you're doing so, which is one of the reasons that they can get a little bit off put about coming in for their recall. So as I say, just being able to practice that one-handed clip on and off, being able to feel for, the D-ring so that you can clip it on and off, really important practice. And just like smooth mechanics like that can make all the difference to our dogs cooperating with us. Another thing to think about is what seems to be the most difficult part of harness wearing for your dog. So for my dogs, they are not really big fans of having things pulled over their heads. So if you have a dog that doesn't like having it pulled over their head, maybe think about a harness that clips around their neck. So instead of having to pull it over their sensitive ears, you can actually just bring it up under their chest and then clip it round behind the back of the head and around the neck. Now, if the sound of the clip seems to make them uncomfortable, practice putting your fingers over the clip as you put it together. This really significantly reduces the sound. So it's as simple as literally you popping your hand over the 2 points of the clip, and then as you push the clip in, you feel it here, but as I say, it reduces the sound of the click, which is just really, really helpful. One thing that might be worth thinking about is if you have a dog that is running to hide under the table every time they see their harness, you might want to consider starting again with a new harness so that you've got no previous negative experiences and you can start from scratch and make it a really positive experience from the get-go. The other thing to think about is, can you avoid walking your dog on the lead whilst you condition more positive feelings about their new harness? So don't mean going out and about on the road without your dog on a lead. I don't mean that at all. But thinking about, could I take my dog in the car? So can I pop them in the boot of the car and take them somewhere where they don't have to go on the lead the other end? That's something worth thinking about when we are, looking to condition more positive feelings to a new harness. Now, step by step to conditioning a positive response to this new harness. So first and foremost, have the new harness in the room when doing a training session with delicious treats. Don't do anything with it, but just be doing a training session. You've got some really delicious treats and this new harness is kind of part of the background. Okay, so it becomes part of good experiences that the dog is enjoying. Gradually have the harness a bit closer to your dog during their training sessions. The goal is that they are ignoring it, that they're not even really noticing that the harness is there. If at any point they start to sort of back off from their training session, you may be taking it a little bit quick. So just slow it down just a touch. During a training session, you're doing your training session, but then you go pick up the harness, put it down, and then reward your dog. Okay, so just the act of picking up the harness still produces something lovely for your dog. Build up to holding the harness whilst you're rewarding your dog. So, you've got it in one hand and then you're feeding your dog over here, then pop it back down. So essentially when the harness is on the floor, there's no treats happening. So, the dog starts to go, hang on a minute, I like it when you pick up that harness because good things happen. Lastly, think about holding up the harness so the head loop is available for the dog to put their nose into it, and then reward them for any movement in the right direction. If you're at all familiar with shaping, this is just the process of encouraging them to start a behavior in the direction that we particularly want, which eventually is going all the way over their head. You're going to build up to having the dog put their head all the way through the loop whilst you're holding it. So lots of rewarding. And again, for mechanics, this is worth practicing away from your dog and just making sure that you're holding the loop in the right place and you're not going to suddenly drop it on them and maybe make them back out of it. And when you've got a dog that is volunteering to put their head through, you want to gently rest the harness on them for a second before holding it again. And again, more rewards. All right. We want this to be a really reinforcing experience for your dog. We're going to build up to the harness resting on them for longer periods of time. And then we're going to start to add in doing up the harness for a short amount of time. And as I say, short amount, it could be 30 seconds to start with. It could be less than 30 seconds to start with. And then we're going to remove and reward the dog. Okay. So, the harness is becoming something which is a fun thing that happens. We want to build up the amount of time the harness is done up for, again, with lots of rewards. And then we want to ask the dog, can they do simple training exercises whilst wearing the harness? Because sometimes the reason they don't like the harness is because it makes them feel a bit funny and they don't know how to perform things. I remember once doing a body awareness exercise of getting my dog to back up. And Vodka was doing this exercise beautifully with no harness on. And then I put her harness on and she suddenly went, oh, this feels a bit weird. And she wasn't able to do the backing up. So it's surprising how much of an impact it can make on their general body awareness. So bear that in mind when you are, asking them to do just simple training exercises to start with. Then we're going to add the lead being clipped to the harness just for a brief moment before it being unclipped and rewarding the dog. And again, you can just start to see how being able to do that with one hand would be really beneficial in this instance. We're going to build up the time the dog has the lead attached. And then we're going to start building in loose lead walking training exercises. We're going to talk about those in a moment. And finally, once you've kind of started to do that and they're doing the loose lead walking training exercises nicely, now we're going to generalize our training in different rooms of your home, maybe moving it out into the garden, maybe the back garden to start with, maybe the front garden, depending on, how difficult either of those areas are, then close to your home. Maybe you're going to go over and visit a relative, etc., etc. A really important note in all of this. If your dog appears uncomfortable at any step, just stop, okay? Just stop. They're not being difficult, I promise. They're just telling you their truth at that moment. And we really need to believe them in order to be able to, get the progress that we're after. So, loose lead walking practice, what does that look like? So it looks like building value for being by our side, both the left and the right hand side. Now, my preference is being able to walk my dog on the left and the right because I like to walk them the side furthest away from traffic. I was like this with my children when they were little. I like to hold their hand and I like to be between them and the traffic. It's just kind of a safety thing from my perspective. So we're going to start by luring our dog into position alongside us, okay? Now, sometimes it can be helpful to do this with something the other side of your dog to make a channel for them to come into. So I've done this before with my dining room table and chairs, that I've stood with a gap that is just my dog size gap between the back of the chairs and me. And that creates this little channel where I lure them into it and then I can start my rewarding. Now, once your dog is in that position, however you've managed to get them there, you're going to start rewarding them with some tasty treats. This could be some of the lovely liver cake that I have a recipe for on my website. It could be my friend Holly Barker has a brilliant one that she calls the doggy crack treats, which is a great name. I've got a whole host of suggestions on my website if you're at all unsure. So I'll make sure to share those in the Facebook group. Now, you're going to repeat this until you're finding it easy to get them into position alongside you. Now, normally when people start, they do find it a bit tricky, but we want to repeat until, as I say, you're like, oh yeah, I can totally do that, Gemma. I'm all over it. Perfect. Then what we're going to start to do is lure their head up and their bottom down into a sit, okay? So we're not even going to start by walking. We're just going to see, can they do that basic behavior of popping themselves into a sit? I'm going to avoid using the word sit until they're reliably doing that because, like I said earlier, they learned their sit probably facing us. And because they learned their sit facing us, when they hear that word, they're likely to want to swing around in front of us. So it won't help us with building value by our side. So we lure them into that position by our side just to start with. Now, you're going to repeat that until you can use your verbal sit cue when they're next to you and your dog doesn't look to move in front of you because they're like, oh no, totally, mum, I got this. I can figure out how to get into this sit next to you. You're going to practice with your dog on both your left and your right hand side. And again, you can use that channel on both your left and right hand side if you find that a little bit easier. And that's where I get started with dogs, because in the comfort of our own home, that's a nice, easy reception school environment. Generally speaking, people are more relaxed when they're in their home as well, rather than out and about worrying about distractions. You notice I haven't mentioned about putting them on a lead or anything like that. To start with, the very basics of this behavior are making sure that the dog is finding that position by our side valuable. And then we take it further from there. Now, in terms of homework for you about this particular training, I want you to come up with a list of classrooms where you could do that little exercise that I've just talked about, bringing the dog into position by my side and asking them to sit. Now, obviously, if you're out and about, you are going to need to use your lead at this point. So make sure that you're fairly proficient at it at home and that you've practiced with the lead at home as well. But then have a look for village squares. If you live close to a village square, check for local markets and avoid those to start with. You don't want to go on a really busy day. Aim to park close by so you can get in and out quickly without having to navigate too much there and back. And that means that you can then just go there to practice this particular behavior. Dog-friendly garden centres can be quite a good place. Head for outdoor areas first, though, as they're less overwhelming. Obviously, being inside a garden centre, particularly at sort of Christmas time, for example, can be really busy and overwhelming where there's lots of things going on. So outdoor areas first are a really good idea. And they probably count as more secondary school, sixth form level difficulty from a dog's perspective, maybe even more depending on the dog. Pet shops, I like to set a couple of tasks actually with pet shops. One is asking a friend or family member to come alongside me and leave my dog outside with them whilst I go in. That's good practice for the dog in terms of, being calm and settling and waiting whilst I'm doing something else. But the second one, if my dog can cope with that, is to maybe take them on in with me and pick out a treat. Now, that one is probably going towards PhD level because the smells in a pet shop for a dog are very much like, a really nice chocolate or sweetie shop from a human perspective. Another idea is lake grounds with ducks or swans. Great place to practice with moving distractions in a safe way, as the ducks are normally quite used to visitors and they're less flighty than maybe some other wildlife can be. National Trust properties, a really good place to check out. Just before you go, make sure that they're either on lead or off lead. Ideally, you want an on lead place where you can anticipate that other dogs will be on lead as well. That means that you're reducing the level of distractions that you're likely to come across. Some of my students have come up with some other great ideas. Local business parks, certainly at the weekend when there's not so much going on, that's a really good place to go. Outside schools at a safe distance, bus stations, train stations, dog shows. If your village is hosting a dog show, maybe going along to something like that. What you want to do is think about rating them in terms of difficulty. So reception school is your, as I say, living room at home, you in your slippers and, dressing gown and whatnot. Whereas your PhD level might be, as I say, that pet shop where there's lots of delicious smells going on. So just have a think about what your particular list of different environments looks like, and then go through that training with that in mind. And that's it for today. Thanks for joining me. I hope this episode gave you that extra boost to make a difference to your collie's behaviour. Today's episode was sponsored by my Border Collie training membership, Collie Culture Club. In the club, you get a video training review, a community Facebook group, and Facebook Live for Q&A just like this one, as and when needed. Don't forget, you can find information about this and all the resources mentioned in the Facebook group. So head over there now. Next episode, we'll be talking about one of the most valuable cues we teach our collies, the Holy Grail, which is a reliable recall, whatever the distraction. So stay tuned. So until next time, stay focused on progress, not perfection. And remember, every small win counts.